For those of you, those few of you who seem to follow me regularly, you must have noticed that there was a hiatus last week, that I did not post another session up on the internet. The reason was my colleagues betrayed me. The two people who are here with me every week each had an important thing that took them away from joining with me on Thursday. So I waited until they could regroup with me. Uh, I have to get my pace back because 2 weeks ago I was in the middle of something. I was describing how I had lost my deanship at the California School of Professional Psychology, Los Angeles, but I had stayed involved with the institution for almost 45 years afterwards. I was first a full time faculty member as I rebuilt my practice, and then I settled just for teaching one course every semester. I loved being in the classroom and I was pleased to be there. And besides, it gave me an insight into what my students were interested in and where the profession seemed to be going. As I moved on year after year, I got increasingly distressed and alarmed with what my profession seemed to have been turning into. And it was reflected, of course, in the standards that the program had to meet to continue to be accredited by the American Psychological Association. We had to follow the national norms for the evolution of where psychology was headed, and the curriculum had to be responsive to what seemed to be the oncoming future developments of the profession. Not the least of which is that somewhere along the line, about 10 years, 10 to 15 years after I had retired, the campus was now mandated to have a course in the biological bases of behavior. That was to be included in the training of psychologists everywhere that the American Psychological Association was asked to provide the seal of approval, and it represented just one more aspect of the increasing medicalization of what was happening to my profession. In my presentation last Friday, I said I'd remain silent about all this, at least in the school. I had not remained silent in the halls of the American Psychological Association, nor sometimes in meetings of the Los Angeles County Psychological Association, but I didn't say anything to the leadership of the school that I was once a leader in. I continued in silence, but I couldn't bear it anymore. And I started reading from an open letter that I had duplicated and stuck in the box of every core faculty member and every contract instructor on campus. And it was in the year, what was the day? 2004, if I remember. Yeah. So I'd gotten about halfway through what I had been saying to my colleagues, and I'll back up a little bit. I'll back up one paragraph. What are we becoming? We are losing the capacity to relate to our clients on a human level, person to person. We trivialize them. We engage with them from a subject object disconnection, which interferes with what Martin Buber described as the I thou dialogue, so essential to healing. We diagnose them and attempt to reduce symptoms. We believe almost everyone should be evaluated for possible psychopharmacological intervention. We treat the stream of our experiencing in the therapy sessions as if it were dangerous. Quote, you have to keep your countertransference in check, close quotes, rather than the richest possible source of inspiration about the nature of the troubles of the person with whom we sit and about the conversations we might have with that person that could promote healing. We use DSM 5 labels to stigmatize and dehumanize clients. Quote, I'm going to see my borderline at 3 o'clock this afternoon, close quotes, and to organize our trivial research studies. And if you add into that bad mix The evil we do to ourselves and our clients in the name of, quote, risk management, close quotes, at the behest of our malpractice insurance carriers, then we are succeeding in murdering most of the humanity that by right needs to be alive in the consulting room. We have even taught our students to believe that it is unethical ever to hug or even to touch a client, for example, and that it is probably unethical, a quote, boundary violation, close quotes, to engage in the most trivial forms of therapist self disclosure. Empirical data about the possible importance of such things in fostering the therapeutic alliance, to the contrary, notwithstanding. These developments, which are esteemed as representing the best in the ongoing march of the profession, have left me feeling ashamed to be a psychologist and brooding about seeking an adult education credential from the state of California's Department of Education, thereby altering my professional identity while still permitting me legally to offer services to the public under a different rubric. I can be an adult educator and stop being a psychologist if I choose that path. This after 49 years of independent practice. The lemming like march of my colleagues also has made me feel content that I am aging and probably will not be able for many more years to go on engaging with my personal way of rising to teaching and psychotherapy challenges, all the while sadly watching the decay of the calling I love with its desiccation of the treatment encounter. It is disgusting to me that what is the standard of care is becoming in the feels not only personally odious, but I believe is increasingly harmful to those who seek care from us as well. My infirmity and death in the years ahead will certainly liberate me somewhere in the flow of my future, ending my having to bear witness to that which is personally hateful to me, or so I have mused to myself and to my wife, and to a few psychologist friends who understand. In various governance positions during the 1990s, in APA's divisions, and at the level of APA central governance, then my evolving present posture and my beliefs rapidly and dramatically altered as the real implications of the very transformation of our calling I had helped craft came to me with a clarity shared only by a few. But early in this decade, it became unbearably apparent that I was indeed in a lonely minority, that my reversal of perspective, my cries of warning, and my attempts to change the wrong-headed momentum of my profession and its evolution were about as effective as King Canute shaking his fist and crying out against the waves crashing on the shores of his kingdom. I got tired of seeing irritated looks on the faces of my APA governance colleagues when I spoke, having it become increasingly difficult to get my concerns placed with ample time for explication on meeting agendas, and having to hear whispers of, there he goes again, when I argued futilely for what mattered to me. As a result, in 2003, I withdrew from any further involvement in APA affairs, came fully home to my wife and family, to my friends, to my students, and to my clients, and I chose to fall silent in all public arenas, surrendering last foolish hopes to matter any longer as a figure in the creation of the history and of the future of professional psychology. 4 weeks ago, I changed my mind about continuing my silence. The change of mind came about in a mysterious fashion. I had some free time between clients. I wanted something to read, but I was too lazy to go to the waiting room to look. grab one or another magazine I might not yet have perused. The only reading material in my office was the most recent issue of the American Psychologist, the monthly outpouring from the American Psychological Association. I sighed. When I picked it up, I saw to dismay that it was the annual awards issue, typically vanity press, an issue stuffed with the puffery about a variety of colleagues who had convinced other colleagues to advance them into some kind of recognition by our national association. Flipped through the pages in irritation, but I was desperate. My eyes fell on, quote, award for distinguished professional contribution to applied research, close quotes, given to Bruce E. Wampold, Wampold, PhD, professor of psychology at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. As was his prerogative, Dr. Wampold had made an address at the 2007 convention about his research, and a version of his address was printed in the American Psychologist following his citation and his biography. I thought, I'll scan through this one. I need to see what our damn scientific colleagues are up to now. And if this is another piece extolling how manualized treatment that trivializes the healing relationship will rescue the purity of the profession, conform to the needs of third-party payers, and ensure that our colleagues receive, quote, the best possible care, close quotes. I was prepared to read, to curse, to withdraw even further into my sense of futility, and at the same time to pick holes in the methodology and underlying assumptions that were leading to the irritating text I was sure would follow. Instead, what I read was riveting. An offer titled Psychotherapy, the Humanistic and Effective Treatment. To my wonder, words made me so proud again to be a psychologist. The narrative represented the best of what we had been trained to be. It was inspiring. It totally turned my head and lifted my mood. It gave me back hope. It filled me with envy, wishing I had Dr. Wampold's methodological and mathematical competencies, and that it would have been me who had written that work. Here was a scholar who was being recognized by our national association. His submission sums up years of carrying out meta-analyses of the corpus of research on psychotherapy, process, and outcomes. He is also a thinker who embeds his comments on understanding psychotherapy in a frame that makes wonderful reference to the variety of ways we humans seek change, medical interventions, and spiritual healing, among others. I am distributing his observations to you, along with these my remarks. In Wampold's narrative, you will see how much of the outcome of what we do is rooted in how well we can make a human connection with our clients. Our capacity to possess and to convey a frame of reference of some kind about the intended work ahead, a frame that makes sense to us and that can be shared with the client so that it makes sense to the client as well and offers hope and the possibility of change to them. And perhaps most of anything secures for them an engagement into undertaking that mutually shared and understood project of their transformation. It is the therapist's capacity to generate the engagement that provides the foundation on which all becomes possible. Wampold acknowledges that the possibilities of change are rooted as well in the other yet to be discovered variables that describe the human connection between therapist and client, and that further teasing out of the complexities of such human engagement provide the directions for future research. But the characteristics I've enumerated above as the elements of change far outweigh the power and benefits to be had by the client from our pursuing any particular orientation or supposedly employing what any of us believes to be the best intervention for particular conditions. The use of our or non-use of our of pharmacological agents and the other variables we have misguidedly insisted were the active ingredients of our work we need to undertake when a new client appears. I have always believed and taught that the therapist was the therapy and have so experienced the nature of our calling over almost 50 years of my own practice. And I have come to the same view from having supervised the efforts of generations of psychologists entering the profession or who are already my colleagues in practice, but want a consultation about this or about that from time to time. It is beyond wonderful to see in black and white empirical justification for my beliefs, beliefs so scorned by most of my others. If the quiet voice of sound science seems to be moving us in a humane direction, maybe there is hope for me yet. Maybe what I have believed and that for which I have been an advocate will not gutter out like a spent flare. Maybe the intellectual textures and false models of the present era represent a kind of temporary insanity in a profession driven by the worst textures of our contemporary culture. The hunger for a quick fix, the growing disconnection between humans and all spheres of life, the profits to be made by medical and pharmacological firms through providing trivial forms of care, and the need to contain healthcare costs by rationing care, disempowering those who need it, and placing many of us who want to be of service in structures where what we want to do is dictated by others who always have their eyes on the bottom line. In the 1930s, the psychologists in Germany rushed to focus their research on studies that would prove the racial superiority of members of the supposed Aryan race. The beauty of what it means to prize all humans and the universality of the simple meaning of being human became lost in Germany until millions were killed in war or were purposely exterminated during World War II. Today, in spite of the supposed objectivity of the march of science, those who pursue science, after all, are always themselves human beings and always carry out the enterprise embedded in a culture carrying rewards for thinking and acting in certain ways. I believe it is true that fish do not know of the existence of water until they are without it. I also believe the water in which all psychologists are presently swimming is quite polluted, but too few of us are calling any attention to this fact. I want to salute Dr. Wampold for the clarity of his vision, and I hope you will yourselves. So here is what I read, as copied from the American Psychologist. All right, it starts here. This is the direct reading of the article. Psychotherapy is a remarkably effective healing practice. Yet the mechanisms by which psychotherapy creates change are not well understood. In an attempt to understand the mechanisms of change in psychotherapy, I compare psychotherapy with several other healing practices, highlighting how the psychological processes that distinguish psychotherapy from other healing practices are critical to an understanding of how change occurs. I focus specifically on the aspects of psychotherapy that are uniquely human and orthogonal to the specific ingredients of various treatments. Finally, I demonstrate how psychotherapy, process and outcome research, as well as research in related areas, comports with the humanistic aspects of psychotherapy. Classifying healing practices. A crucial step in undertaking a phenomenon involves scientific categorization. Scientific categorization depends on classifying the phenomenon and related phenomena on the basis of essential rather than superfluous characteristics. Psychotherapy is a healing practice seemingly similar to some other healing practices and unlike many others, depending on the characteristic that one makes salient. Through description and discussion of 6 exemplars of human change, the characteristics that are deemed important to psychotherapy become apparent. Peter, a Native American, here are some case examples. Peter, a Native American, is depressed, abuses alcohol, and has occasionally thought suicidal thoughts. On a return trip to the reservation when he grew up to visit his ill grandmother, he runs into a childhood friend who arranges a traditional sweat for him and his family. As a result, he develops a relationship with a traditional healer who removes evil spirits. Peter's problems lessen, and he returns to work. Susan, who experiences acute pain in her gut periodically during the day, presents to her physician, who orders laboratory studies that confirm her suspicion that she is suffering from a gastric ulcer. Susan begins a regimen of antibiotics and a proton pump inhibitor, which reduces her symptoms. After the course of treatment is finished, laboratory studies are negative. Serena, in middle age, presents to a psychologist because she is suffering from chronic anxiety about many aspects of her life, has periodically exhibited many symptoms of depression, and complains of a lack of romantic and intimate relationships in adulthood. And she receives a diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder. Her experiential therapist explores the death of her father and her mother's series of boyfriends, helping her process her feelings with regard to these events and the actors, and has her express previously expressed grief. Her symptoms gradually decrease over the course of therapy. Wilhelm has led a particularly unremarkable life, earning just enough to support his hedonistic lifestyle, which included recreational drugs, alcohol, snowboarding, and women. Feeling increasingly lonely, he agrees to attend church with his current girlfriend. After a period of erratic church attendance, he breaks up with the woman, but seeks solace for some people in the church, including the minister. Soon thereafter, he is born again, gives up his hedonism, and becomes a practicing evangelical Christian. James feels lethargic, sleeping 10 to 12 hours per day. His attendance at work is erratic as he avoids several situations that he finds stressful, and he no longer has an interest in previously enjoyable activities. He presents to his internist, who explains that he is depressed. The depression is caused by a chemical imbalance in his brain and provides a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, SSRI. In about 2 weeks, he reports increased energy and enjoyment of various activities. Pat is suffering from symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of military service in Iraq. She is referred to a psychologist who administers the standard cognitive behavioral treatment, including relaxation, cognitive restructuring, and prolonged exposure. After 20 sessions, the symptoms diminish, and she no longer meets the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. These 6 exemplars can be characterized in various ways, and each characterization reveals something about the purported mechanisms of change involved. Putting aside a readily apparent classification based on professions, 2 treatments are delivered by physician, 2 by psychologists, and 2 by religious figures. Classifications and explanatory systems, scientific validity, and adherence to a medical model, as depicted in Figure 1. All right, from now on, I'm going to have a figure up on the screen. Let's do share. I will assume that this is visible unless I hear a protest from my in-person listeners here, and I don't seem to be hearing a protest, so I'm assuming they can see the graphic. Essentially, there are 3 systems involved in the 6th treatment: biological, psychological, and religious spiritual. Those are there across the top: biological, psychological, and supernatural. Where am I? Okay. The bases of the 2 medical treatments, antibiotics for gastric ulcer and antidepressants for depression, are biological interventions. Philosophically, medicine rests on the concept of materialism, which considers matter as the sole basis of reality and thus attempts to explain phenomena as a consequence of the interaction of matter. Applied to medicine, materialism implies that any bodily state, including most importantly illness, has a physical substrate, and treatment involves altering some biological system. Treatment of depression with SSRIs, one of the change exemplars, makes the assumption that the disorder has a biological explanation involving, in part, neurotransmitters, and that the biological intervention specifically remediates the biological cause of the disorder. The treatment for gastric ulcer specifically reduced the population of H. pylori bacteria, the biological cause of the gastric ulcer. In addition, to be established as bona fide medical practice, medical interventions must produce benefits over and above what can be achieved by means of hope, expectation, or relationship with a healer. That is, it must be shown that the treatment is more effective than a placebo. 2 of the treatments, CBT for PTSD, and to an experiential treatment, rely on psychological explanations and would be classified as psychotherapies. Of course, the particular psychological explanations underlying these 2 treatments are quite different. The explanatory system of the 3 main forces in psychotherapy, psychodynamic, behavioral, and humanistic, offer dramatically different psychological explanations for various disorders. The variability in psychological explanations has given rise to a plethora of psychotherapies numbering in the hundreds. In this regard, the class of treatments based on psychological explanations, characterized by a variety of explanations of the same disorder and a large number of treatments, differs from the class of treatments based on biological explanations, characterized by modal explanations of a disorder and a small number of treatments. So far, I've classified antibiotics and SSRIs as biological, and CBT and psychodynamic experiential as psychological, on the basis of the systems used to explain the disorder and construct the treatment. In contrast, the Native American and Christian exemplars, here they are up here, Native American rituals and born again Christianity, belong to a class whose explanations are based on what might be characterized as supernatural, religious, or spiritual. The bases of supernatural, religious, and spiritual treatment appear at first glance to be orthogonal from the empirical foundations of science, which leads to a second schema for characterizing healing practice. Here we go. It's the one labeled scientific validity. Consider another classification, one based on the scientific validity of the treatment using the principles of the medical model. Scientific validity in medicine rests on an empirical demonstration of materialism, in that it must be shown that substances and procedures that can constitute medical practice are beneficial because of their direct effects on the anatomy and physiology of the patient. The term specificity is used to indicate that the treatment works through the hypothesized biological mechanism. Stephen Jay Gould cited the demonstration that the effectiveness of Franz and Anton Mesmer's treatment was not due to animal magnetism as one of the crown jewels of the scientific method. The establishment of specificity in medicine was made possible by the development in the mid-20th century of the randomized double-blind placebo control group design, which by 1990 was required for the approval of drugs by the Food and Drug Administration and continues to be so required today. With regard to medical treatments, the scientific method requires the establishment of biological mechanisms of a disorder, as well as the demonstration in a clinical trial that the administration of a substance to treat the disorder has effects attributable to the specific ingredients. The two medical treatments, the antibiotic treatment of generic of a gastric ulcer and the antidepressant treatment of depression, meet the standards to be classified as, quote, scientifically valid. The scientific validity of various psychotherapies raises some thorny issues. A case has been made that psychotherapy is an amalgam of treatments, some of which meet sufficient criteria to be called scientific, and others of which do not. This distinction has been made notable by David Barlow, who discussed two classes of talk therapy, psychological treatments and generic psychotherapy. Psychological treatments build on characteristics found in a variety of treatments, including the therapeutic alliance, the introduction of positive expectancy of change, and remoralization, certain important specific psychological processes targeted as the psychopathology at hand, and so on, should be considered scientifically validated. Treatments lacking the specific psychological procedures to which Barlow refers would be designed as generic psychotherapy, whereas those containing ingredients would be psychological treatments. Barlow's distinction between psychological treatments and generic psychotherapy rests on the specificity of action, the very notion that is one of the defining features of the medical model. That is, psychological treatments, while using talk and the context of the therapy as means of delivery, provides ingredients that demonstrably remediate psychological deficits and produce observable change. Generic psychotherapy, however, may create change through creating hope, remoralization, and changed expectations and belief. However, these are the very mechanisms often used to explain in psychological terms change attained in religious and indigenous healing practice. So here we have certain kinds of psychotherapy over with the non-scientific practices of Native American rituals and born again Christianity. the treatments between the distinction between treatments based on scientific psychology, i.e., behavioral therapy, and those based on mentalistic and unobservable constructs, most notably psychoanalysis, was made at the origin of the behavioral approaches by Eysenck and others. Because CBT for PTSD is based on sound psychological principles, has been shown to be efficacious in several clinical trials, a case could be made that it belongs in the category containing scientifically validated treatments. However, many would contend that experiential treatments of generalized anxiety disorders would fail to meet the criteria used to establish scientific validity because this approach to treating generalized anxiety disorders has not been manualized, has not been found to be efficacious in clinical trials, and does not rest on canonical psychological theory and research. From a scientific perspective, change accomplished in religious or cultural practices has been mostly dismissed. It could be argued that the change was non-existence in the sense that it was reported by a practitioner or a client, but was not documented scientifically. An alternative expression, though, is that the change was palliative only in that the recipient of the practice felt better, but the underlying psychology, either biological or psychological, was unchanged. Finally, if change is documented, it could be attributed to the placebo effect. Healing occurred, but not through a specific mechanism, an explanation which has been relegated to the backwaters of medicine and psychology. In this respect, the experiential treatment of generalized anxiety disorder would be classified with the two religious, spiritual, cultural treatments, in that the treatment has not met the criteria generally accepted by the scientific community as necessary to qualify as scientifically valid. Now we move on to the third way of categorizing certain kinds of things that seem to change people: medical versus contextual. Jerome Frank has proposed a different classification scheme entirely, one in which psychotherapy is considered a cultural healing practice, more in line with religious and indigenous healing practices than with medical treatment. According to Frank and Frank, healing practices involve an emotionally charged and confiding relationship with the healer, a healing setting, a rationale or a conceptual scheme, and procedure that both the healer and patient believes in, and involved active participation and positive expectations for change. According to this perspective, these aspects of healing practices are the critical ingredients of the treatment, whereas in medicine, it is the medicine's direct effect on the biological system. What the healing practices in the latter category have in common is that they appear to be embedded in a cultural context, rely on the interactions between the healer and the recipient of the treatment, and involve the interpretation of events and their meaning. Modern medical treatments purportedly can be differentiated from cultural healing practices because medical practices have a scientific biological basis and have been subjected to the challenge of placebo controlled trials. Although it is recognized that cultural context and patient preference and expectations are important factors in medicine, the emphasis of evidence based practice in medicine is on the effect that substances or procedures have on the biological system over and above the effects of a placebo. Accordingly, the classification of the 6 change exemplars are now contain 2 categories: medicine and a relatively ambiguous class that might generate labels such as traditional, cultural, indigenous, or simply other. for it associates psychotherapy with a variety of practices that, while perhaps not ineffective, have not been empirically shown to be effective. Where does psychotherapy fit? The practice of psychotherapy, in which two conspecifics engage in verbal symbolic interaction with the intent to heal, is unique to humans. That is, psychotherapy is not a healing practice that can be used with non humans in the manner, say, that modern medicine is practiced with animals, i.e., veterinary medicine. When viewed from this perspective, psychotherapy does appear, perhaps uncomfortably, close to various religious and cultural practices, as Frank and Frank have proposed. In some ways, psychotherapists walk a precarious epistemological tightrope. Psychotherapists use the language and research tools of medicine and science, but employ treatment procedures that may depend on the same psychological mechanisms as religious, spiritual, and culturally indigenous interventions. The thesis offered here resolves the tension by positing that the change process in psychotherapy occurs to a large extent in the context of human interaction between therapist and patients in ways that are consistent with theory and research in cultural anthropology, evolutionary psychology, and related areas, and thus is scientific. I now turn to a discussion of the aspects of the psychotherapeutic process that involve the communication between the therapist and the patient, and how their communication is not simply a necessary condition for the remediation of dysfunctions, but is the primary mechanism of change. The humanistic aspects of the conceptual model, human abilities and psychotherapy. The human brain is not simply a more advanced computing device than those possessed by non human animals. That is, the distinction between humans and non human animals extends beyond the notion that human brains have more storage, faster processors, and advanced circuitry, which can then be applied to multiple and more complex tasks. Rather, the human brain evolved with certain specific propensities that contains specific logic and conveys certain adaptive advantages. For example, humans have specialized ability to detect and recognize faces, as opposed to other similarly complex but less important objects. Several of these specific capabilities are intimately involved in the process of psychotherapy and may be at least partly responsible for the benefits experienced by patients. One of the specific strengths of the human brain is related to interpreting events, contrasting explanations, constructing explanations, and attributing causality. Religion and science are two, albeit very different, comprehensive systems for confronting phenomena. Excuse me for a second. I'm getting some eye strain. Not surprisingly, the propensity to construct explanations has been applied to bodily phenomena as well, and thus the very origin of humans is associated with efforts to explain and treat illness. According to Sir William Osler in 1932, the desire to take medicine is one feature that distinguishes humanoids from their fellow creatures. Although nothing is known about the earliest medications or about the first physicians, historians date the earliest portrait of a physician to Cro-Magnon times. This horned-tailed, hirsute, and animal-like apparition had great psychological effect. Indeed, it is possible to identify historically it is impossible to identify historically any evidence in which medicines, rituals, or healers were not central features of that culture. These practices and their accompanying explanations were generated by the prevailing metaphysical zeitgeist of the society. According to Pythagoras, for example, matter was concerned of the basic elements earth, air, fire, and water. And analogously, the body was composed of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Personalities were manifestations of mixtures of of humors. The word temperament coming from the Greek temperamentum, meaning a blending of humors, which created health when balanced, and illness was not unbalanced. I'm going to skip over some because I think some of this is not relevant to what I'm talking about or interested in. And I think I will go to his conclusion. Yes, it's getting late. All right, here's the conclusion. Psychology's dual heritage involves the scientific and humanistic traditions, and this heritage has often divided the discipline. On the one hand, the scientists have found applications of psychology to be not particularly scientific. Those aligned with humanistic aspects of psychotherapy, on the other hand, have perceived scientific investigation to be focused only on aspects of psychotherapy that are irrelevant to the essence of the endeavor. Yet each perspective brings to the endeavor strategically important contributions. Although healing practices have existed since the beginning of the human species, the efficacy of nearly all such practices has not been subjected to what would be considered a scientific test. Modern medicine emerged from this multitude of healing practices as the scientific application of biological knowledge to cure and prevent diseases, reduce mortality, and prolong life. The development of randomized control group designs allowed the demonstration that the chemical ingredients of drugs produced effects beyond those created by the mind and established the efficacy and specificity of those substances. The application of the randomized design by clinical scientists and the study of psychotherapy has robustly shown that the healing of practice is remarkably efficacious. Indeed, psychotherapy is effective as or more effective than many established medical practices. The contributions of science to the establishment of psychotherapy as a legitimate and effective practice should not be undermined. Those interested in the humanistic aspects of psychotherapy tend to focus on the interpersonal relationship between therapist and patient and on the process of psychotherapy. Research has shown that these variables related to the interpersonal process are robust predictors of the outcome and are likely causally involved in producing the benefits of psychotherapy. Moreover, the focus on particular treatments as a source of variability and outcomes has produced little evidence that the type of treatment administered accounts for much of the variability and outcomes, or that particular ingredients of particular treatments are necessary for the successful treatment of a particular disorder. It appears that the focus on therapeutic interactions as the critical aspect of psychotherapy is justified by the research evidence. The humanistic and the scientific strands do not need to stand in opposition to each other. The mission of science is to explain, discover, and understand. It is time for science to be applied to the humanistic aspects of psychotherapy, the better to understand the intricate nature of a remarkably effective healing practice. I like his conclusion, and I will stop at that point. I'm sorry, I think some of what I read was quite boring. You have to be an academic to appreciate it. All right, let me stop sharing and I will open the floor. Stop sharing.
Arthur,
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to be a fortune teller
Oh,
and to predict the future of psychotherapy. Oh, let's say 10 or even 20 years from now. What would you say?
well, I love what I read to you. I believe that if we continue to focus on what are the relational elements, what are the non-specific elements that are going on in the psychotherapy relationship, and start studying them in more detail, even such things as what is the fit? How can we predict a better fit between the therapist and the client? Do they need to have similar values? Do they need to be close to each other in socioeconomic status? These things have not been studied yet, but they can be studied empirically. And I believe more and more there will be support for letting the therapist and the client evolve what the work is going to be and how it's to be done. That will prove to be the most powerful and efficacious way to work with clients. And now I'll get sad. That will not have much effect on what we become because we are in the grip, at least now, of who is paying the bills for things. And if the bills are being paid by third party payers or by the government, they have a vested interest in keeping the costs down, controlling them, and not necessarily allowing psychotherapy, whose aim is life transformation, but rather wanting kinds of psychotherapy that are much more limited and hoped for outcome, reduce experience distress some, and that's what they will pay for. They will pay for more limited ways of approaching a client that have manualized manuals that are to be followed and specific things that should be addressed. And we shouldn't talk about the other things or let the conversation drift off into other areas. We have to keep focusing on what we learn, and we will learn increasingly effective ways for reducing panic attacks, for instance, or other kinds of unpleasant behaviors. We will become more effective at that too. The dollars will flow into those things. And those of us who want to keep what he calls the humanistic strain of psychotherapy going will have to move out of accepting reimbursement from third-party payers with the control that's involved for that. So I think there will be probably a robust number of those of us who continue to practice as we want and who work out ways to be paid for directly by clients rather than by third party payers, because then that's the only person we have to satisfy is not the person who's paying us, but the person who's consuming our services. We'll work for them, but it will be only a portion of us, maybe a third of us 20 years from now, maybe less. I don't know. And will we continue to want to share a common identity? I don't know. Are we going to start being some other name? Are we going to be coaches? Or as one of my clients is about to become life transition coach. That's what she's going to be. That's what she wants to be known as. So are we going to focus on other matters other than the small kinds of things that the insurance companies want us to focus on? If you're a life transition coach, that means you're available to somebody over the whole lifespan, because we're constantly going through one kind of transition or another.
Mhm.
It sets a more ambitious and wide-ranging agenda. So that's my prediction.
Yeah, I'm not too optimistic. I suspect, I mean, there's already work with computers doing, using artificial intelligence, doing kind of motivational interviews to some
Yes.
success,
Yeah.
and that's only going to improve. And there will be probably aspects of what we do that are entirely, without human interaction.
Oh, Scott, let me return to what you asked me. There's an intervening variable that has some power too. The American Psychological Association accredits graduate training programs in psychology, and it has its own set of criteria about what the school should be teaching, and what competency should be acquired by the graduates going through that program. At the present time, the American Psychological Association is leaning some pressure on the membership and on training, and in its lobbying for legislation. It sees the future of the profession, the applied part of clinical psychology, as being people who will take up roles in medical settings. We're going to be working in hospitals, clinics, and in doctors' offices. It's sending us into the medical model. And in at least 3/4 of the states in the nation, one must have graduated from an APA approved doctoral training program to be eligible to sit for licensure. So I am not sure we're going to be teaching many courses that would allow the students to feel comfortable in, or to understand the taking up of the kind of role I have been describing and experimenting with for myself. If there are no role models and no teachers in one's training, it's pretty hard to move out beyond that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Oh, there is a way to do it. Oh, the humanistic psychologist may set up postdoctoral training programs in humanistic psychology, just like the psychoanalysts have psychoanalytic institutes. So we may have places to go for psychologists who are already out of graduate school, have stumbled across our existence and what we do, and may want to become more like us and want some systematic program training and how one does that. So it may be done at the postdoctoral level, part-time, while they're working in whatever jobs they have. Oh, I like that one. That's a good one. Good, I'll live for 30 more years and I'll become the director of one of those postdoctoral institutes.
Why wait 30 years?
Because I don't know who would sign up now.
Well, I don't think there's going to be more of that DNA in 30 years coming out of the graduate schools.
When I talk to most of them, I still interact with graduate students. I supervise a few occasionally, and I have a few as my own clients. They much more would be like what I'm doing and what I'm talking to them about than anything their professors are teaching them about. Hmm. Bah. You talk about interacting with the computer.
Hmm.
Uh, I'm thinking of Harlow's work with the monkeys.
Yeah, with the compensatory rocking.
Right. The fabric covered doll-like monkeys had the better developing chimpanzees, but even they were clearly not as good as the ones who had human mothers, had actual real living mothers.
Hmm.
So I think the computers can take us part way. I don't know how far. Will they be more like the mothers of the wire monkeys if one tries to get therapy from a computer?
It'll be interesting. Yeah. There's I think it's called the Turing test, which is the moment when a computer, Turing was the guy who cracked the Enigma in World War II.
Yes.
And there's an idea that at some point we won't be able to distinguish the prompts from a computer from another human being. And that's the direction it's heading. Now, people are already doing text therapy, right, with therapists,
Yeah.
assuming there's a person on the other side of that.
There may not be at all.
Yeah, eventually there may not.
Oh, now you're bringing up an entirely different philosophical question, because I was thinking most human computer interactions are with an obvious robot that you're talking to. My guess is most of it will just be through hearing. There'll be a conversation going back and forth, and there will be a computer that's being talked to.
Sure. Yeah.
If, however, robots can be created that it's impossible to tell whether they're actually human beings, that's the Turing test. Can you really create a robot that doesn't only think and act like a human or talk like a human being, but is indistinguishable from a human being? Oh, that's what Ex Machina is about. I love that movie.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful movie. She passes the Turing test. She actually decides to go live among humans and never reveal to anybody that she's not a human being. So if we get to that state, maybe sitting in a room and having an interaction with a robot like that could be as healing and inspiring as a real human being.
Can you program a robot to provide empathy?
Yeah, well, I believe it could.
Go ahead and ask your Alexa. Tell her you're feeling sad. See what she says. I've checked on those. She'll like, oh, I'm sorry, and then if you need to talk to somebody and all kinds of stuff.
Need to talk to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. What if you say I need to talk to you? I wonder if they put the psychotherapy programming into Alexa yet.
They do a little bit. They do around, like, if they're trying to make sure if someone's in big distress that she'll offer up a suicide prevention number or something like that.
Aaron, I didn't know you were that lonely.
Yeah, we have long, extensive conversations.
All right, gang. Thank you. I'll be on to something else next week, and I'm going to go take a walk with my wife.
Okay.
Excellent.
All right. Have a good
day.
weekend.
Yeah. Bye, guys.
Bye.
We'll see you.